Hello, this is Eric Devereaux, and welcome to yet another video in this series that goes through material in my textbook, Methods of Policy Analysis. In this video, we're going to turn, as part of our new unit on interventions on designing theories of change, and where you're trying to transform a public policy situation to have a less acceptable to a more acceptable outcome. We're going to be turning now and looking at efforts to intervene in markets. This is important because a huge amount of what governments do in the modern world is intervene to influence markets. In the previous video, I went through the chapter of the book, in a previous video, sorry, I went through a chapter of the book that discusses market failures as types of processes in public policy that result in less than desirable outcomes when there are aspects of a market that do not comply with the expectations that are set by economic theory for what it takes for a market to give us a reasonable, sometimes called an efficient result. So here in this video, we're going to be turning and looking at chapter 10. So as I've done before, let me just start off by just showing you the first page of chapter 10 and share that with you. And you can see that it is about changing market outcomes and about conducting policy analysis to try to figure out what has gone awry with a market and what might be done to push the market in a direction that serves society better, that serves the client better, that produces those better outcomes than what we currently are seeing, the more preferable outcomes than what we are seeing. One of the most important things I want to emphasize up front is that this reads a little bit like a diagnostic manual, and it should be treated like a diagnostic manual, and it is useful in that regard. If you are working on a public policy problem that has features that involve markets and markets not doing what we would expect markets should do if they were performing up to standard, then you identify the type of problem the market is experiencing, and that almost automatically gives you a laundry list of options for what you can use to try to intervene to push the market in a direction that gives you those more preferable outcomes. So that said, let me switch now, as I've done before, and start sharing a device that allows me to draw for you while I talk. And I'll also be rotating my screen over a little bit so I don't disappear off camera while I'm doing this. So here we have this, and now I'm going to start going through a couple things. So first off, it's really important to note that there is a laundry list, like I said, of things that governments can do. So when we're talking about government interventions in markets, and again, this is something that governments do all the time, there's a common set of actions that governments can take or have taken in the past to intervene in markets, and I just want to go through those with you. So the first thing that markets can do is governments can do, they can simply prohibit some type of economic activity altogether and say, even if a market wants to supply a product or a service to the consumer, this is absolutely prohibited. There are many prohibitions you may be familiar with. Of course, the most famous one in the United States, the prohibition against the sale of alcohol before the Great Depression, that among other things did something that prohibitions on markets often do, which is to create illegal activity, sometimes called the black market, to produce and sell those goods, even though are strictly illegal. The United States is still struggling with all sorts of issues that are connected to markets when the production of a good or service is still strictly forbidden. Something else that the governments can do all the time, and they do all the time, is they can permit activity, which means they can regulate, right? They can permit it, they can allow it, and in some cases you even have to get a permit from the government to do that. For example, construction permits. If you wish to build a building, you have to have a permit from the government that gives you permission to build a building. But overall, governments can say a wide range of economic activities in the marketplace are completely fine. Go and do that. Only if something goes terribly wrong will we intervene, but otherwise that's all allowed. Governments can regulate markets and say you can do something in the marketplace, but we're going to regulate some aspect of it. And we're going to look at a couple examples here, but regulation includes regulating prices, but it also includes regulating behaviors and setting other rules. For example, workplace safety regulations that say that people in the workplace cannot be subject to risks that might damage their health and safety. Governments can, on their own, inform consumers about aspects of products and cut around the marketplace and go directly to the consumer and say, here is a product, you may be using it, but it is known to have defects and you have to be careful. One example of this is a recall of an automobile for some type of defect, where the government issues a recall and says the manufacturer must do something about that. Or a warning sent to consumers who are using a prescription medication not to use the medication in manners not prescribed by a doctor, as it might cause untoward circumstances. Governments often impose taxes. And governments can use taxes for a variety of ways to try to influence market behaviors, to make some market activities more expensive and to make other market activities less expensive, because you can both raise taxes and cut taxes. Governments can subsidize economic activity and say, even though the marketplace is not generating this activity directly, we will subsidize it to get more of that occurring and make sure that some type of product or service is available at the level that the public expects it to be. And then something else that governments can do, often very controversial, is governments can compete directly with private producers in the marketplace. This often generates a lot of activity in the courts in the United States, but it does occur. One example is that the city of Philadelphia set up its own Wi-Fi network, high-speed Wi-Fi network for use by the residents of Philadelphia, because it felt that the private providers of Wi-Fi and internet services were discriminating against low-income households in the city and helping to accentuate what is often called the digital divide. And the city of Philadelphia set up its own internet service with Wi-Fi. The private producers did go to court to stop that, and they lost that case. And the city of Philadelphia, best I know, continues to supply Wi-Fi to the residents. As I did before, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some examples of market failures, and we're going to very quickly identify a government intervention. I'm not going to go through everything that's in the book that goes through more detailed downstream consequences of doing this, but just to look at the intervention. So the first one we're going to look at has to do with the general topic of public goods. As you might remember, a public good is one that when you produce it, you cannot restrict who has access to it, and one person's consumption of the good does not affect anyone else's consumption of the good. The most canonical example of a public good is national defense. Once you start supplying for the national defense of a country, everybody inside the country is protected. And my consumption of national defense does not affect your consumption. It becomes very hard to price national defense for sale at the individual level. So here's the thing. Here's the process result. In a market process, if you have a public good, you can have no, or you could have low production of a good or service that is deemed necessary and important to the public. Yes, public national defense is one of them, but also public parks could be an example, or the criminal justice system, something like that, okay? So this is our process result. We are not getting enough of what it is we would like to have with regard to a public good, because the private marketplace will not give it to us. So we now need a theory of change, okay? We need a theory of change or an intervention that will address this. And there are several possible theories of change that directly can address this problem. One is direct production by government, like when the government makes a park. The government can actually just get in the business of producing the public good. And it does it with tax dollars, and it makes it and it doesn't try to sell it. And we get public parks, for example. Or you could try to do subsidies. The government could directly subsidize organizations that produce public goods and pay them to do it instead of doing it directly, okay? And so this theory of change is commensurate with the problem if the government is able, through its own means, to either directly produce or to subsidize the production of the public good at the level that gets you to a more satisfactory result, a more satisfactory outcome, enough national defense, sufficient numbers of parks, these types of things, okay? So that's an example of a theory of change and an intervention by the government. And it could be completely commensurate with the problem. Then we have information asymmetries. Information asymmetries occur when either a producer or a consumer in the marketplace knows more about the good or service than the other side of the transaction does. So the most classic example of this is when the consumer becomes harmed because they buy a product that has negative consequences that they were not aware of at the time they purchased it. And again, the problem here is that all of that is not included in the price. If the consumer knew more about the product, the price might fall. Because they're like, okay, you can't sell me that product for that price because it has risks associated with it you have not told me about. Okay, so what happens with information asymmetries, for example, is um, one example here. This isn't the only one, but one example of the process can be the consumer. The consumer lacks information that would change the price. So the consumer might end up paying too much for something. In the most extreme case, if the product is outright dangerous, then the price could fall to zero. In other words, no one will pay anything for it because it's just too dangerous to be used. But often what happens is consumers end up paying too much money for something that turns out to be dangerous or has other effects they weren't aware of. Okay. So the most common government intervention, right? The theory of change that is most commonly applied here is very simple. The government takes action to inform the consumer. So the government steps in and says, if the producer will not tell the consumer something about a product, the government will tell the consumer something about a product. The most famous example of this in American history that I'm aware of and is dealt with directly in one of the early chapters in my book, is that the US government in 1964, Surgeon General's report told the consumer that cigarette smoking was very harmful to health, definitely associated with lung cancer, and people should not smoke cigarettes. And that was an effort to do something that the industry was never willing to do, which is to inform potential and current smokers about the inherent dangers of tobacco use and nicotine products. Okay, so the government took direct action to inform. It was not, however, fully commensurate with the nature of the problem. It was not sufficient to drive smoking quickly to zero. We've been able to drive down tobacco consumption fairly low in this country relative to where it was 50, 60, 70 years ago. But, for all intent and purposes, really, most nicotine products should not be available to the consumer. They remain a hazard to health and should not be sold. So this particular intervention that the government took was not sufficient for that challenge. Okay, let's go to another market failure. Let's talk about natural monopolies. We're not going to do all monopolies, we'll do natural monopolies. So natural monopolies occur when creating the means of production of a product is incredibly expensive. So examples include building an airline, or building a railroad, or building a modern giant tech company like Google or Microsoft or Meta. These are all potential natural monopolies. Okay, Amazon.com may essentially have become a natural monopoly in many ways, because building another Amazon.com is phenomenally expensive, and no one is trying to do that. They have a couple competitors, Walmart, Target are in the game there, but nothing compared to Amazon. Okay, so first, the process result, and of course the natural monopoly we all deal with all the time is our electricity or our natural gas provider, our energy providers, or some cases the company that provides your drinking water. So the process result of natural monopoly is low levels of competition or no competition, high prices, potentially very high prices. Monopolies like to charge a property all the price as high as they can get it. They don't have competitors that can undercut them, and so they will do that if given their best chance. So the theory of change that is used all the time for dealing with natural monopolies is government regulation. Okay, the government regulates prices. This is often a highly political process. Governments usually set up some type of a board that is involved in price regulation, whether it's your utility. Utilities have to go before these boards on a regular basis and ask for annual price increases and justify them. They have to go before the regulators. But government can tell natural monopolies, okay, you can exist. We will not try to create additional competitors to you. That's too expensive and unwieldy. We'll simply step in, and under this circumstance, you're going to have to accept the fact that we're going to regulate your prices. Now, political monopolies are monopolies that exist because of political protection from competition. And that's a very simple case. The government, through antitrust provisions, often tries to step in and break up politically created monopolies in order to open the way for more competitors to be competitive in that marketplace. Right now in Europe, regulators in Europe are trying to do things to force Google and Microsoft and Meta in a direction that looks like breaking up politically entrenched monopolies. Okay. And then lastly, we're going to talk about externalities. So externalities are the consequences of a market process, a transaction in the marketplace that are not captured in the price. And the most common form of externality that is talked about in our world is pollution. The pollution that is created through an economic activity, and the polluter who makes the product, or the consumer for that matter, who may actually be directly responsible for the pollution entering the environment, is not asked to pay for that. And that means that the prices that the consumer pays in the marketplace are too low because the externality has not been captured in the price, and there's no revenue coming into anyone to help to do things like clean up the water, clean up the air, or pay for the installation of equipment to prevent the pollution in the first place. So the process result in this case, the process result is, for example, pollution from production. There's many examples of this. The one that we've been fighting over the most recently would be carbon dioxide and its consequences in the atmosphere for global climate change, but it's polluting the waterways with the consequences of industrial activity. It's very well known as a problem, okay? So, theory of change. There are several theories of change that have been put forward for dealing with pollution, okay? So one is to regulate. Command and control regulations regulate and include that with fines. The companies that do not comply with the regulations get fined and have to pay fines if they pollute. And so that is one theory of change. Regulate and say you cannot pollute. We're going to force you to install equipment to prevent the pollution from happening in the first place. We could even close your industry down if we had to. And if you don't do what we say, we will fine you. And another approach that's been tried has been taxes. And what governments have done is they have stepped in and they have taxed polluters for their polluting activity. And then the polluters often will say, okay, we won't do that anymore because we don't want to pay the taxes. Once we have to pay the taxes on pollution, then there go all our profits, and we no longer can make the money we were trying to make from this activity. And that's also been pursued as a financial approach to trying to deal with externalities. So what you can see is that in each case we have a market process that is generating a result that may require intervention by a government through some form of public policy. The process clearly creates an outcome that is less than desirable in the eyes of your client, in the eyes of a portion of our society, in the eyes of a group of voters, whoever its perspective matters here. It is worth saying that there's plenty of policy analysis that goes on from the other side, from polluters who have tried to say that their pollution should not be taxed. The tobacco industry fought successfully and politically for decades to protect itself from attack, claiming that consumers had the right to smoke, and that was their own decision, and they were fully aware of the consequences. There's been tons of policy analysis paid for by those organizations from their perspective, defending their perspective in the policy process. I just approached this from the other side just for the examples here. So this is what this chapter goes over, and it talks about creating these theories of change, which come from this list of alternatives of how governments can intervene in markets. Let me stop the share there. And thank you again once more for watching this video. Hope you got something valuable out of it. Definitely please read chapter 10 of my book on intervening in markets. It goes into all of these examples in much greater detail. It shows you examples of feedback loops that can develop in the process to accentuate the consequences of government intervention. Next time, in the next video, we're going to turn to the next step in the book, which is about once you've identified particular alternatives that you might use to try to intervene in a public policy problem and produce a more preferable outcome, how do you think about those alternatives to make a choice of which one to recommend. So that's up for the next video. Until then, thank you again for watching, and see you next time.